Hello, I'm Mark Unkefer, and welcome to Direct Line, Montgomery County Republican Club's online show. And this week we have as our guest Rob Bluey, who is the executive editor of the Daily Signal, which is a outlet from the Heritage Foundation. He has got a long and extensive background on on the communications medium. You've been at Washington Examiner, Human Events, Daily Caller. You started out in college at Ithaca College, working for the student newspaper there. I worked for Roy Park, Park Communications, which was based in Ithaca, New York. I worked they had a property in New York City. I worked in the broadcast end of that. And I am really struck by how much the news business has changed since he had, I think, 100 newspapers. He had a full complement of TV stations. He was convinced that he had a monopoly that at those days was good for all time. And we've seen what's happened to the news business. You've been at the kind of, how shall I say, the cutting edge of the response to that. What are your thoughts about what somebody from that era would make of where we are today?
Wow, that's a good question to kick off with. I mean, we have seen so many radical changes in terms of the media business. It's hard to fathom just how rapidly things have changed. We find ourselves in a situation now where there's just so much going on with digital communications. And I don't know, frankly. The advertising business has been completely upended for
Right.
media companies. So much is now reliant on digital. So it was a time that I was at Ithaca where we were still in concentrations. I was in the print concentration. I can't even imagine that schools were doing that. You have to be adept at doing everything now. You can't just be focused on one certain concentration. If you're a journalist starting out today, you need to know how to probably be on camera. You need to know how to take photos. You need to know how to tweet, be adept at social media, and write a good story.
That is a challenge, and it's interesting that the era that we were talking about was really there was sort of the mode for newspapers was a kind of regulated monopoly, or not regulated, but a kind of de facto monopoly, and they took that kind of sensitive as a kind of because of their unique position. Whereas now, lots of different vehicles are available to talk to communicate with the public, and you've been through a number of them. That's really a lot like it was in the 19th century, before the sort of the middle of the 20th century, when newspapers kind of consolidated.
Well, I'll tell you, it's one of those things where we are grateful for the opportunity to communicate directly with the American people. We now find ourselves in a situation where we don't have to rely on a filter to get the message out, and I think that that's something that is something that we all should be thankful for. I mean, who does this better than the President of the United States? Look at how he can impact the news cycle with a single tweet. And it's one of the reasons why 6 years ago, the Heritage Foundation decided to make the decision to launch the Daily Signal, which is our news organization. We were frustrated that it was increasingly difficult to get our experts on television. It was one of the reasons. Another factor was the increasing competition on op-ed pages. So why not create our own? And I think we've had some great success and been effective at doing so. We're not the first to do that. There's a lot of conservatives that have gone down that path, and I think that hopefully it'll lead to a better situation in the future where more Americans can get their news without having a certain bias attached to it.
And you've got in your background some firsthand experience with the kind of bias that the monopoly, or when we had the filters in place, going back to the Dan Rather report in 2004 with the National Guard. Could you provide a little background on that? Because I think that was really, if ever you're going to a
That was
time
actually the turning
when,
point, I think.
well, it was going that way, but boy, you certainly put it in hyperdrive with that. But give me some background about how all that took place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a period of time when you started to see bloggers on both the left and the right start to have a big impact. And it was, during that presidential campaign, that a lot of the narratives that you read in the mainstream media were being influenced almost on a daily basis by what the chatter was on people using, the old blogger site or a WordPress blog. It was so easy for anybody to create their own site and start publishing. Remember, this is before Twitter. So in some respects, Twitter came along and it took the focus away from blogs. But that was a situation where you had some folks, whether it was a Free Republic or Little Green Footballs and other places that saw the 60 Minutes report. They started to poke some holes in it. CBS actually posted the documents on its website, so it was anybody was able to access them. And when I was working at CNSnews.com at the time, which is part of the Media Research Center, and when I came into work the next day, my editor said, "Take a look at these. Do you see anything questionable?" And I said, "Not at first glance. What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, look at the font. Look at the typography." And it was clearly Times New Roman, which anybody who knew anything about computers and typewriters, and I'm old enough to have learned how to type on a typewriter, that I knew that was not a font that you would find. And so what did I do if not just call 3 independent people who and an expert in knowing fonts and typography. They looked at the documents, they made an assessment, and within minutes of CNS News publishing its story, it was on the Drudge Report. And the Drudge Report at that time, was a major driver of what the news covered. Now, we have to remember, it took days of sustained pressure on Dan Rather for him to eventually come around to admit that there could be problems with it. And to this day, Dan Rather still will not really acknowledge that he screwed up. I mean, I think that despite the fact that CBS hired the former Attorney General to do its own investigation, would have suggested that Dan Rather should admit that he was wrong in terms of how he pursued the story. But Mary Mapes and the other people who were involved clearly had an axe to grind against President Bush at the time, and were intended for this story to take him down. It ended up backfiring. It ended up, I think, inspiring a lot of conservatives to get involved with blogging and become more active in the digital space. And fast forward to today, and you look at see the success that somebody like President Trump has had using social media and some of these platforms, these influencers who are out there who in some ways rival the major media networks in terms of their reach and influence.
It's unimaginable if you think back to if the same story had run 20 years before as the 60 Minutes story, there really never would have been that kind of scrutiny. We would have had to wait for the historians.
I mean, look at the Westmoreland, famous 60 Minutes Westmoreland interview where basically CBS just made stuff up and they were sued as a result of that. And Reed Irvine, who we talked about a little bit earlier in the green room, launched Accuracy in Media right as a result of 60 Minutes bias against General Westmoreland, that infamous 60 Minutes interview on the Tet Offensive. I mean, in this, just imagine if there was no internet, if there weren't folks like yourself, no CNS News, we could be staring at, we could have seen a President Kerry Edwards administration in 2004.
Well, I'd also just point out, look at what we're doing tonight, and your ability to reach people directly and not have to go through a filter. I mean, it is truly tremendous, the opportunities that are afforded to us. I think that with that obviously comes a certain amount of responsibility. If you're a publisher, if you're a broadcaster, there are certain things that come along with that. There's a lot more scrutiny on you as a result. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think what it means is the American people have so many choices today that it's sometimes hard for them to decipher what is true and what is false. And our social media platforms sometimes don't make it any easier on us.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it isn't a complete free for all, if you will. I mean, the social media platforms have a unique legal status. In a unique role where they kind of straddle a role of, on one hand, being a publisher, and on one hand, being sort of a open conduit. And some respects have a bit of both worlds. I was reading, you guys have had a YouTube video taken down so it certainly looks like they're using, again, they're not a government, so the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. But on the other hand, there's responsibility. Why don't you elaborate a little bit about the experience you have, and we can talk about the legal issues later.
Yes, this is actually the second time we've had a dispute with YouTube over a video. Perhaps not surprisingly, both have a commonality in that they're both about this debate over gender identity and sexual orientation, and involving a pediatrician who was warning about the dangers of giving puberty blockers to young children. So YouTube was censoring this doctor's views. The next one that just happened that you referenced, which we disclosed last week after we were unable to successfully appeal to YouTube, involved somebody who is a former transgender individual who was talking about his personal experience and offering some warnings and advice. And I think that it's troubling that YouTube is using its hate speech policy to remove this content. In the most recent example, it was actually a 3-hour event, a half-day event that we hosted at the Heritage Foundation. The entire event was removed for basically what amounted to 3 seconds, a total of 6 words that YouTube deemed to be hate speech. We know at the same time that there are people out there on the left who are looking for any way that they can to censor the content that's coming out from the right. And even though that in this most recent example, there are other people on YouTube, the same platform, saying the same thing, and there's medical research behind what this gentleman Walt Heyer said, YouTube decided to pursue it. So this is hardly the only example. The Heritage Foundation isn't alone in this.
Yep.
President Trump has now, I think, had 3 times where he's had run-ins with Twitter. Just most recently, with a tweet he shared about this autonomous zone that they want to create outside of the White House. I disagree with Twitter's decision on this. I think that they certainly, as a private company, are within their rights to set their own guidelines and policies. I don't agree with how they're implementing them in this case. And that goes for pretty much all the social media platforms. I think some we've had less challenges with, Facebook being an example. We might not like the reach or engagement we necessarily get on all of our Facebook posts, but Facebook so far has not moved in the direction where they've outright censored our content.
So talk about what the process is with YouTube. I mean, explain how do you appeal that, and what you may want to elaborate a little bit on this legal issue of a private entity, but also having some First Amendment responsibilities.
Yeah, so it's interesting because in both of the cases, it took quite a long time for YouTube to actually remove the video. In the first case, the Dr. Michelle Cretella video, which was a Daily Signal video, was posted in 2017, and we didn't find out until 2019. So it was up for 2 years before YouTube took any action on it. The most recent example, YouTube updated its hate speech policy, by the way, in August of 2019. And so anything that was posted after August of 2019 is subject to also getting a strike on your account. So I think the first time YouTube finds that you've been in violation of the hate speech policy, they'll give you a warning. After that, they'll start giving you strikes. And if you get a certain number of strikes, I think it's 3, your channel will be suspended. Your whole channel, not just the video, will be suspended. So there is a risk associated with this. And now the Heritage Foundation has a warning on its channel. So what happened? October 2019, we posted the video of the full event. It sat there for 6 months. On March 3rd, we got a notice from YouTube that it was in violation of the policy. So if you go to the link on YouTube, you will just get a black screen that says this video has been removed because it's in violation of the hate speech policy. On the back side, in your creator studio on YouTube, you get a little bit more explanation, and you have the option to appeal. So we talked to people directly at Google and YouTube. Google owns YouTube. We were unsuccessful in our appeal. We talked to many individuals there, and we decided that, after all of our efforts, that we would decide to push back. And so what we decided to do is not re-air the 6 words, because we knew if we did, the video would be pulled down again.
Correct.
We bleeped them out. And we had a short commentary from the gentleman, Walt Heyer, explaining why it was unfair and unwise for YouTube to block this video. And I think that there are, look, the full video is still available on Facebook. So individuals who want to see it and hear the 6 words, that they still can do that. But it's a process. Let me tell you that, to go through with YouTube. And even an organization like the Heritage Foundation, can confront this censorship. I think there are individual Americans who don't necessarily have a line directly to Google's office, and that's what concerns me even more. And I have people reaching out to me all the time, telling me that the reach of their Facebook posts isn't what it used to be, that they're getting restricted on YouTube, and Twitter is doing things to them. And I think that that's why there's a building frustration. People who expected these platforms to be an open forum are finding that there are certain limits that they're now putting on them.
And
Now,
it's
go ahead.
and it's
Right.
yeah, and I was saying it's funny that YouTube, I mean, you can go on YouTube any day of the week and you see all these scammer videos saying, oh, send us money. YouTube won't do anything about that, but anything that has praises President Trump, something positive about America, those are more likely to get struck down by YouTube than somebody if you're scamming and creating a Ponzi scheme.
That's a good point. There's a lot of content out there that that I, as the father of 3 kids, wouldn't want my kids watching.
Exactly.
Let me put it that way.
I was just going to pick up on this legal status that the platforms, the tech companies have an exception or a protection where they're not accountable for the content that takes place, and it's because they're providing a conduit. They're basically providing a forum for it to take place. And now some, such as Senator, there's been some discussion about changing the protections that were put in place in the 90s. I don't think it was necessarily envisioned. There's some pluses and minuses because, of course, it then allows for less control of their own platforms, so that entities like cable companies or what have you would have less control over what the content is, and so you would, could be pornography. I mean, there could be a lot of things would take place. So what is Heritage take? What is your take on what the status of those protections should be?
Sure, and President Trump just made this issue front and center because he recently issued an executive order in which he's asked the federal agencies to take a closer look at Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That's a law that was passed back in 1996, I believe, so a long time ago, before many of these platforms even existed. So we recognize that it's an opportunity to take a closer look and examine them, and perhaps there are changes that should be put in place. I think it's a challenge, though, to do so. I think that look no further than the issue that the Federalist, a conservative news site, faced last week when Google, NBC News, we should point the blame where I think it is rightly deserved. NBC News contacted Google and said, hey, this conservative website has content in violations of your terms of service and they should be demonetized. And then, there was a back and forth, and ultimately the Federalist had to remove its comment section in order for it not to be demonetized, which is a move that I think was unfortunate because, I mean, let's face it, that's an important part of that website and that community that the Federalist has. But it just goes to show the power that the tech companies have. A lot of people commented that, well, geez, it certainly seems like Google is acting like a publisher in this case and not just a neutral platform. So if Google's going to behave like this, should they be treated differently under the law? That's certainly something that I think people will challenge. I think, as you both know, the PragerU and Dennis Prager have challenged YouTube, for instance, for restricting some of the PragerU videos. You can't view them in schools or libraries because they've deemed them to be kind of age inappropriate, and they've challenged that. So far, they've lost in the courts, but I think that there's going to be continued scrutiny on this, and probably, we always point to Congress and say, we want Congress to act, particularly after these 2 Supreme Court rulings last week. This is another area where I think there needs to be a legislative debate on it, and probably a closer look.
It's not an easy thing to resolve because I think we respect that private entities should have some control over their own content. And so there's probably a continuum that exists between what is an open platform where you let lots of, let things take place. And there was also content that is maybe more family friendly, and it exercises more of the role of a publisher in determining what's going to be there. So it's hard to figure out what the right balance is going to be for that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we as conservatives, I think definitely respect that these companies do. They're private companies, they're private entities. They should be able to set their policies, just like we wouldn't want the government coming in and telling you, how to run your club, or the Heritage Foundation how to run its organization. I mean, obviously there are regulations and laws that do. We have to operate under the 501c3 IRS tax rules, right? But I think that we as conservatives generally want to resist the government interference, and that's the right move for conservatives. That's the right decision for conservatives, the principled decision that conservatives have. At the same time, it's incredibly frustrating, I think, to the grassroots activists and those who want to make their voice heard and are sometimes frustrated and stymied by these platforms. So there's no easy answer, as you indicated, but I think it's a debate that's certainly worth having.
It would be nice to have more of a conservative friendly or more balanced platforms available to be able to
do you know if anyone's done any studies on demonetization of the left on YouTube and social media compared to kind of like similar to what the study Lefevre did with newspapers, and how they have is there, where he basically pointed out what we all knew for years was there's a leftist bias in the media against conservative values and conservatives in general. Has anybody done anything with it?
I don't know any. When you ask, for a study or data, I don't have any hard or concrete information. I do know anecdotally that the left does complain that they are also, being deplatformed or censored, or there are restrictions put on their content as well. But it would be interesting to see what it looks like. My sense is that conservatives are probably feeling the pressure more, in part because many of these tech companies are led out of Silicon Valley, which we know is a significantly leans to the left. Much of the leadership leans to the left, which is why I think last year when Mark Zuckerberg came to Georgetown University and he delivered a speech in which he was talking about the importance of free expression, it surprised a lot of conservatives. And conservatives thought, well, geez, maybe there's actually somebody in Silicon Valley who understands what we've been saying all along. Now, just because the CEO of the organization says something doesn't necessarily mean the policies and practices of that entity will follow it. But I definitely think as conservatives, look, we welcome the debate. We want to have more conversations. It's the left that's trying to shut things down. Look at what's happening in America right now. Look at what's happening on college campuses. Look at what they're trying to do, erasing our history. I mean, it is shameful. And conservatives, we're standing, we're standing here wanting to have a conversation, and instead they want to just silence us.
I mean, there's a statue in Washington, D.C. of Abraham Lincoln, which was funded by a large portion by former slaves, called Emancipation in Lincoln Park. Now they want to take that down. And do they even understand the history behind that whole thing about how it was?
There's a definite historical component to a lot of this stuff.
Do you understand that it was former slaves that commissioned the statue and so on? And they're all about taking down statues, and anybody who speaks out against is branded a racist. And you're pro-slavery if you say you don't want the statues taken down.
It's a difficult time in which we're living, and I think this is why I think you've heard the importance of leadership and particularly local leadership. What happened in Seattle was just was so disappointing, because you didn't have a situation there where the mayor or even the governor were stepping in and things got out of hand in CHOP or Chaz or whatever the name is. And we can't let that happen in other cities. And so, I recognize that there's limits on what the president can do. I think the president with his bully pulpit can certainly make sure that the message is heard loud and clear that we need to have law and order. And that's, I think, what an increasing number of American people want. And that's what you're going to, that could be a dominant theme in 2020, this debate that you're seeing. And I think the American people, at least based on the public polling I've seen, don't want to erase our history, don't want to tear down these monuments, and think that the left and these radical demonstrators in our streets are overexerting themselves.
And they don't want to give control to a mob,
right.
Like in Seattle, or even to an extent in DC. It's like, they've renamed, part of 16th Street to Black Lives Matter Plaza. But what are you going to do when things open up and you got to open up 16th Street? Are you going to keep that there just to obstruct traffic, or?
But I think conservatives welcome the conversation about the history and the debate that can take place about what things mean and the pluses and minuses. I mean, we reflect human beings, which they're all flawed in some ways and have strengths in other ways, and we can talk about that without having to make these binary decisions of we're going to get rid of somebody because of some particular aspect of their life. Rob, you've been in the media, but you've been in Heritage now for quite a long time. And so you've probably seen a lot of the sort of new media come and go over a period of time and sort of the ebb and flow. Well, where do you think we're going to be? Now, you started in 2007. So looking 13 years out, do you see some consolidation taking place, or do you see, instead of 1,000 flowers blooming, 1,000,000 flowers blooming, or some combination thereof?
Well, I do think that you'll continue to see changes, particularly in the digital media space. It's hard to predict what Twitter or Facebook will look like in 13 years, or if they will even exist, and if there's something else that comes along. I mean, remember there was a period.
Remember MySpace, right?
I was going to say. That's right. There's all of these examples. I think that the tech sector is one that changes rapidly. You have places, DuckDuckGo, trying to make a case that it's a superior platform to Google because it respects your privacy. Now, whether or not the American people will follow is another question. I think you still have to have a good product and something to sell. In terms of the media specifically, I think you will continue to see consolidation, particularly in the more establishment or legacy media entities. I think that you're seeing it right now. COVID-19 certainly has maybe sped up the process from a local news standpoint, where it's increasingly difficult for these local news entities to bring in revenue and continue to employ reporters. Look, I got my start at a weekly newspaper in upstate New York that no longer exists because it couldn't adapt to the changing circumstances. And I think that that's unfortunate. What I hope happens, though, is that there are other places that pick up the mantle, maybe digital only, because there's vital information about our communities that I think we as Americans still need to know about. And if you don't have that local newspaper that's serving you, there should at least be some place that you can go and get information, if at the very least to hold our elected leaders accountable at the local level. I used to cover town council meetings and village board meetings. And if there wasn't a reporter in the room, frankly, I'll tell you, I think that they probably could have felt like they would have been able to get away with a lot more than they did.
So one of the interesting challenges is, do you have this opportunity to do the kind of digging that used to be done by reporters? Do you see that as an opportunity?
I think, well, yeah, I mean, specifically with investigative reporting, I think that that's an area that conservatives can absolutely grow. The left still dominates in that that particular space. There are a number of conservative entities that have tried it. We have an investigative reporter at the Daily Signal, would like to do more of that. It's a challenge. I mean, investigative reporting, as you know, takes a lot more time. You have a lot of media entities that are more interested in the quantity of content than the quality, in part because the social media platforms seem to reward quantity If you can have a reporter doing 8 or 9 stories a day, they're producing perhaps a lot more clicks and advertising revenue than if they spend a week working on a single story. Now, that single story might have a much greater impact in the long run, but it's hard, I think, sometimes for publishers to to do that. There are interesting models. I know that there's been a lot of calls recently for wealthy conservative individuals to make investments, maybe in nonprofit news organizations or other places that would be able to do this. And as a nonprofit news organization at the Daily Signal, I certainly think that that's a model that could be successful. You have to give your customers something that they want and desire, and we've tried to do that at the Daily Signal by delivering unique content. We've always had a focus on multimedia, for instance, whether it be through podcasts or Facebook videos or documentaries. And I think that that's something that each conservative site can carve a little niche out for, and we'd be better served as a result of that.
Well, I think it's a great opportunity. I think we all remember how the changes that took place in talk radio, again, the end of the fairness doctrine, opened up a whole vehicle that was available that conservatives seem to have dominated over the years. There certainly have been efforts to do more liberal shows, but that again, that was a functional law that before you couldn't have done what Rush Limbaugh and others do because you were required to have both points of view. So we kind of recognize how things can change over time with that.
And we've also seen, we've seen in state of Maryland, we used to have in the Maryland DMV area, we used to have a whole bunch of local newspapers. Like in our county, Montgomery County, our last local print newspaper went away. So pretty much it leaves county council, state legislative officials. Pretty much they've got free reins without really doing anything. They can do whatever they want. And there's no really, because the news media in the DMV is more nationally focused. They don't care what's happening in Rockville or Annapolis or Richmond for that matter. They care what's happening in Washington. And I think it's giving a lot of the politicians, one of the things is a free pass on a lot of things they do when they're in legislative sessions.
Especially, I would say, Dwight, if you find yourself in a situation where, in my own case in Fairfax County, where there's, just one Republican on the Board of Supervisors, and that lone voice, Pat Harity, will take a stand and try to hold the line, but you're so outnumbered that you don't necessarily have that ability. So I think that in a big urban area or even a rural area where one party dominates, it's important to have the news media in a position where they can report for the community and be present for some of these meetings, these decisions, and look. If we've learned anything from COVID-19, I think we've learned the importance that local officials play when it comes to making decisions.
Right.
We see that playing out right now in the DC area and in Maryland and Virginia in terms of the reopening, and holding them accountable and making sure that we are in touch as citizens in those communities is critically important, because it's affecting our lives and our livelihoods.
That is certainly true. And I encourage everybody to use those Freedom of Information requests to ferret out information. And I think there's a great opportunity for people working collaboratively, much the way you did with the Bush National Guard case of working together, sharing information. It isn't necessarily one person, but can be pulled together and cumulatively can have a really positive impact.
It definitely can. When conservatives are united, we are stronger. There's no doubt about that. And when you have so many different conservative media outlets today, I think it definitely illustrates the success, frankly, and the fact that there is a robust audience out there of conservatives, millions of people who've lost trust and faith in some of these legacy media outlets. And as a result of that, they're looking for alternatives. And so we have to be obviously good stewards, good journalists. And to your point, I think whenever there's this kind of collaboration, and I think one of the most recent examples you see is the fact that conservatives are out there on the front lines of these protests and these demonstrations that are taking place and reporting truthfully what's going on with video cameras. I mean, the pictures don't lie.
That's certainly true.
Yeah,
There's a lot of information that gets shared that way.
Yeah, it's like if you a couple weeks ago, they said that the president, had the protesters tear gassed when that never really happened. But 10 years ago, that would have been the narrative, and they would have run with it, no matter what really facts on the ground were. Now they can't get away with stuff like that, which is great part of technology and instantaneous nature of media. I think that was one of the things. I think when Barack Obama was president, I think one of the things he kind of feared was that. That's why he wanted that kill switch for the internet, if you recall. Back then, he wanted to kill the internet.
Oldie but goodie on that one. Well, anyway, we really appreciate having you on and sharing your thoughts. It's really kind of informative. I think all of us are really appreciating the kind of outlooks that you're doing, the kind of information that you're getting that we weren't getting before when we were dealing with just the Washington Post and the New York Times. It's great to have a range of voices out there. So thank you all. This has been the Direct Line on Montgomery County Republican Club's weekly show. Thank you for being on the show, and for all our viewers.
Real quick, Rob, what's the Daily Signal URL, and where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's dailysignal.com, which is part of the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. And Dwight and Mark, let me thank you, because I think that, as I said earlier, what you're doing here is really tremendous in taking the message directly to an audience. So we'll continue to do our news reporting and great commentary, and I encourage you to keep it up here, because we all have a stake in this, and we all have a role to get the information into the hands of the American people. So thank you.
Thank you. And don't forget to follow and like us on Facebook, and tune in next week.